The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Have you ever wondered why a company would do something stupid that would cost them their brand, reputation, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and some of their best employees? Each week, management and HR consultants, John Tallheimer and Chuck Smickian, dive into the stories that matter and discuss the lessons and what we should do to protect our organizations. Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. On this week's episode, John and Chuck talk about pregnancy discrimination in the workplace and the new laws that are going to effect in 2023. But first, here's what's happening in the human resources news. Hey, Chuck, what's going on? Welcome. What's happening in the news?
Well, you were just about to tell me, and that's why I hit the record button, that you were just watching a TikTok this morning.
I was watching
a TikTok. Me, John.
Chuck has brought me into his world. And it was interesting. This was a therapist that on TikTok told everyone that she quit her job. And so this is what happened. Her boss wanted her to come to a meeting in the workplace. So they work from home, but they wanted to have a meeting in the workplace. And it was an hour away. And I'm not going to tell her story very well. But so she was like, oh, can I just do a Zoom? I can't get there. I have a client that I need to go to. And by the time I get there, it'll be 30 minutes late. And so can we just do a Zoom? It'd be much better, blah, blah, blah. And the boss was like, nope. And so she just quit right there in the spot. And I, to me, I have a couple things, right? And it's like, I'm not sure what the purpose was of not allowing somebody to be on Zoom and trying to kind of work around that. And there may be, obviously we're only getting one side of the story there. But also, I think that's very privileged to be able to say, well, just quit. Just quit. If your company's not doing what you want, just quit. I don't think all of us have that option to do that. And I think we need to be aware that there are individuals that may be wanting to quit because we're doing something that they don't really appreciate, and listening to our employees and trying to make sure that we're creating a great culture on there. But I don't know if I would go that far. And again, maybe my generation, I would go that far just to quit right on the spot. So I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that goes in line with an article that I read this week where some employees are not just upping and quitting. And I believe, and I've been there too, where a lot of employees, if they have something in their back pocket, like they've been thinking of quitting, they've been wanting to quit, and they just need that one straw to break the camel's back. So they do it. And it's a big statement. The old take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more. We should write that sounds like a title of a great song, a lyric, right? Lyric. Sounds like a country song, John. But yeah. I've been, and you're in Nashville, country, right? You're a country.
I know country. Yeah.
So, but it reminds me of articles recently in the news I've been reading. We've heard of quiet quitting.
Yeah.
But one of the things I saw on TV and an article was something called slow-mo Mondays, where employees are coming in off the weekend and they're coming in on their first day Mondays and they're giving half efforts. And it's a trend, and it's a social media trend where people are like, I'm coming in, I'm rolling in. Mondays are not meant to work hard. So I'm just going in slow motion. Right.
It's interesting, right? Because I think one of the things that I've been really thinking in my deep thoughts, right, in the back of my head, is I think we need to redesign the workplace. And some of these things make sense, right? I get like Monday mornings, you after a weekend, you may not have as much energy you have. But what does that look like for the workplace? What does that look like in terms of productivity? What does that learn in effectiveness? And so kind of diving into that, I think is really kind of important because, and I think, I know you're going to talk about another article. I think that leads into that article. So anyway, talk about that article that you're reading about. What did you call that?
Yeah, so I came across an article this past week where, in addition to quiet quitting and slow-mo Mondays, there is a trend called resentism. And I don't know if I'm spelling it good. It was a resentism. Resentism. And that's where employees are resenting their job, but they're resenting it in an outward fashion. In other words, they are purposely missing deadlines. They resent their job. They resent their boss. They resent their company. They're missing deadlines. They're turning in sloppy work. They're basically not doing what they need to be doing. And they're being public with it on social media. And I found that to be just really, I don't know, there's a word for it, but I don't know if I could say it here, but really gutsy. I guess you say gutsy in a bad way, that someone feels comfortable to do that. But the article went on about how companies really have allowed that to happen in some ways and how to kind of push back a little.
And so what was their advice? What should we be doing in terms of, I don't want to say stopping this, but in terms of when this happens in our workplace?
Yeah, the whole idea is it comes down to accountability. And I guess the article went on to say that over the past few years and the lack of employees and, with COVID and, blah, 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 employers have been, blah, 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 have been reluctant to hold employees accountable. Because they're afraid, oh my goodness, they're going to quit. Oh my goodness, we're going to lose them. Oh my goodness. And so they've allowed these things to happen instead of holding people accountable for their specific job and their specific roles. And so that was the main advice, was hold your folks accountable. Don't allow these things to go on and perpetuate, because they will just not go away magically. They will just continue to get worse.
Yeah. And again, I work in that sphere a lot with performance management. I just did a presentation of full day training around it, and holding people accountable is the manager's role, the supervisor's role, the leader's role, holding them accountable. And in truth, when we look at the data, our employees want us to hold them accountable. They want to know clear expectations. So if I don't do this, what's going to happen? And I think the other side of that, Chuck, is I think a lot of times people don't know what discipline to put in place, or how do I hold them accountable, other than say, you need to do it. And if they don't do it, what do I do? Right. And so how do I handle that? What are the ramifications if they don't do that? Right. And so I think that becomes the conversation with managers and supervisors and leaders, is what is that accountability? If somebody doesn't do it, what happens to them, right? Are they not going to get a job? Other than a poor evaluation, is it going to be reflected in their salary increase, right? Making sure that it's clear what's going to happen if you don't do your job. And I don't think we're good at that typically across the country. I don't think we're clear about that.
Yeah. John, there are all kind of articles coming out, new laws coming up, and folks, you're listening and hopefully you're hearing it all. We're breaking it down for you here on the HR Stories podcast. And in fact, if you want to go in deeper, we're going to invite you to join our HR Team of One community on Facebook. John, it continues to grow. We get 10, 20 new members every week, and it's such an interactive portal. People posting questions, situations, HR folks helping HR people, small business owners, other leaders that have HR responsibilities, posting questions and relying on their peers and colleagues across the country. And I know you and I are both active, but you've been especially active in answering questions and jumping in and giving feedback.
Yeah, and there was actually one on here. I don't know if I still have it up. No, I don't know. Somebody was on there the other day, and it was a good question. So they have employees in different states, right? And so there's been a lot of that, like, oh, I have employees here and that kind of one. But this particular one was like, what states have mandatory sexual harassment training as part of their laws and regulations. And I would like to say that I have that information in my hands, and I don't, but let me see if I can do it off the top of my head. California, Connecticut, Delaware, Chicago, the city thereof, New York City, the city thereof, Illinois,
New York.
New York. I think there's one other that I'm missing. But anyway, paying attention to that, right? And so knowing your state laws, and if you have employees in that state, you need to be making thing. I don't know, Chuck, maybe you can kind of sum it up quick. And I had this in my class the other day. One of the questions that come up is like, well, I have remote workers in these states. Do I need to follow the laws in that state? And so what's your answer to that? What have you been giving our clients or your clients when they ask that type of question?
Yes, you do. And here's a lot of the new state laws are actually accounting for that, because they know that there could be one employee in that state versus, but their headquarters could be in Florida, which doesn't require that. And I'll give you an example. The law in Chicago specifically says that if you have employees, and this is interesting, if you have employees in another state, but they interact with the employees in Chicago, you need to give those employees sexual harassment training. So
that's interesting.
So there are, I know the answer in HR, John, a lot of times is yes, maybe, it depends. Remember, you were going to have a t-shirt made up of that.
I know, I need to do that. We're working on that.
I'm in HR. The answer is yes, maybe, it depends. Yeah. So, but that's the answer. Yes, maybe, it depends, but probably yes.
Yeah. And again, paying attention to it. There was somebody talking about, she has an employee up in New Hampshire. This is the first time they've had anybody up in New Hampshire. How do I deal with that? How do I make that happen? And so, you have to do your research now. Now I have an employee in New Hampshire. What are the breaks? What are the responsibilities? There was somebody in the team of the HR community of one said, I had people in Massachusetts and they live in New Hampshire because of the taxes and knowing that, right? And so New Hampshire and Massachusetts do have some tax laws that you have to pay attention to because Massachusetts was very concerned during the beginning of COVID that everyone was going to go live in New Hampshire and still work out of Massachusetts. So paying attention taxes as well becomes an issue as well, right? So there's lots of complications with it. And I think I had somebody, and maybe you told me this story, Chuck. Somebody was like, you can be remote from anywhere except for California.
Oh, well, there are companies that I'm working with as clients that will not hire remote employees that live in California to work in California, New York. They have a list of states. And so, because if you have a company based in Florida, which has very little state laws, and a lot of the laws are pegged to the federal laws, and then you decide to hire that one employee in California or two employees in New York, you have to create a whole new benefits packages. There are so many laws you have to worry about, and it takes up a lot of companies' times, especially smaller companies that don't have large HR departments. So they're like, all right, we're just not going to hire people from these particular states. Drop the mic, hands down.
Yeah, it's tough. There's a lot. Again, a lot going on. Diving into it, taking time to know your state law becomes really important. I have a great story to tell today, Chuck. Ooh,
I know you do.
About these stories. Do you think we should take a break? Should we dive into the stories? I'm not really sure how we should go to this today.
I think we should dive into the story. One of the things I like about the HR Stories podcast and our team is that last week and the week before, we launched two stories, one based in the 1971 Supreme Court case of Duke versus Griggs, and then the other one with Beth Farragher, which changed sexual harassment laws forever. That happened in 1998. This week and next week, we're looking at laws that are just fresh on the books, that are coming up in the next couple of months. So I like how we switch things around. And John, I'd love to just jump into the story right away if you're up for it.
I'm ready. I'm ready. This is what happens when our producer's not here with us today. So Sam, we're missing you. We need you here. But let's just jump into the story, and then we can kind of take a break when it seems to make sense to take a break. And then we'll kind of get in there. All right. So this week, I want to focus our attention on moms and soon-to-be moms in the workplace. Each year, there are hundreds of pregnancy discrimination claims in the workplace. And according to recent research, 1 out of every 4 moms has considered leaving their job due to a lack of reasonable accommodations or fear of discrimination during pregnancy. And 20% of experienced pregnancy discrimination in the workplace. So 20% of moms have experienced pregnancy in that workplace, which is a lot if you think about that. And it was, to me, I remember when I was reading that in prep for this story today, I was like, that's a lot. I didn't even think about that. And so it's something we need to there. So we're going to share some stories, Chuck, around this topic. We're going to talk about our legal responsibilities. I also want to make sure we work to deal with employees who become pregnant while working for the company on there. I don't know, Chuck, you've done this for a while. Do you have any stories that you could tell kind of from your day working in the hotels or anywhere else where you're like, oh, let me tell you this story?
Sure. No, I don't have anything shocking or whatever to tell you, but we did. Yeah, but absolutely. We have had employees, whether they're working in the office, whether they were working in, say, housekeeping or even maintenance, that had become pregnant. And some employees would work up until the day they gave birth. Some employees would have some sort of maybe complications, and they might request a reasonable accommodation. For example, if they needed to sit in between, a front desk employee, in between checking employees in. Can I have a stool to rest? Can I have a uniform accommodation of sorts? You know, we don't have, I need larger pants and things like that. So yeah, in the places I've always worked, we were always very guest service friendly. So we were always employee friendly when it came to situations like that.
And that's great, right? And that's great. When I was working in corporate America, I was interviewing for a manager role. So we had a department that was managerless. The other person had moved into another role. So we didn't have a manager. And so we were interviewing for this manager role. And so always, right, interviewing a bunch of candidates and kind of going through. And I found this perfect candidate. She was just going to be the perfect candidate. And so I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to hire this person. I talked to HR. And all of a sudden I get a call from my vice president. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? And they're like, and they said something like, are you sure she's the best candidate for the job? And I was like, what? What do you mean? She was easily the best candidate, like easily the best candidate. And so I asked politically, I said, well, what are your concerns? And he said, well, she's pregnant. And do you think she'll come back to work? And he was right. She was pregnant. I think she was 4 or 5 months pregnant at the time. And her and I had a very candid conversation about that. I didn't bring it up. She was very like, this is my plan. I'm going to work up as close to the due date as I can. I'm going to take a couple months off, and then I'm going to be back in the workplace. And so looking at this, and to be honest, right, I had to kind of think about momentum, right? And so my only concern was not that she was going to be a great manager. Would I lose momentum while she was out on leave? And after she was hired, her and I had a very good conversation about that. And we're like, all right, how can we keep that momentum going? What can we do while you're out on leave? And so we created this whole plan to do it. But I was getting this pushback before I hired her from the vice president, HR a little bit. But I thought about it and I'm like, no, she is the right candidate. And here's the thing that I think all of us have to put in our minds when we're thinking about that. What is the long-term decision you're making for that person, right? And so I knew that she was going to be gone for maybe 3 months, right? I knew she was going to be gone for 3 months, but I wasn't hiring her for a 6-month period. I was hiring her for a long-term tenure job within my company. And so ended up hiring her, one of the best managers I've ever worked with. She is now a senior executive in a retail company up in New York City. Highly would recommend her for any role in there. And so again, thinking beyond the momentary loss of momentum, how do we make sure those people are there? So,
yeah, not all employees are as lucky to have maybe a good or progressive boss or company that sees beyond the pregnancy, but it is something historically that women have had to deal with over the years. That's why there are a number of pregnancy discrimination laws out there that I know we're going to talk about, especially some new laws coming up.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, right? And so, right. And so researching the story again, I read this article in the Harvard Business Review, and we'll put that link in there for you guys. There was almost 15,000 pregnancy discrimination claims in the last 5 years.
Oh, my.
That's it for that, right? 15,000 pregnancy discrimination claims coming out of the workforce. That is a lot of claims doing that. And so, Chuck, what do you think? Why do you think there are so many there?
Yeah, I guess it is just a general, maybe it's a misunderstanding. There's bias against pregnant workers, what companies can and can't do. And so sometimes they may just stumble into things. And I know we're going to talk about it a little later, but our producer, Kait, our social media producer, Kait from Front Porch Social, has shared some of her story with us also, where companies just bumble into this sometimes.
Yeah, they're not prepared. They haven't thought through that process. They think about it, but they don't put everything into place. And so again, right, one of the biggest issues is just lack of knowledge. What should I do? And I need to protect a pregnant worker. What does it mean to protect a pregnant worker? Sometimes, and we see this a lot coming from supervisors and managers think they're doing the right thing. Like, oh, I'm going to give you light duty because you're pregnant. Right. And so that comes off as discriminatory or upsetting because maybe you're doing light duty now, but you don't get the same amount of pay. And so again, playing this out and going, okay, what can we do? And having conversations with the individual, the mom to be, becomes really critical in there as well. And what's interesting that I found was that the experience of pregnancy discrimination are linked to an uptick in mom's stress, which then lead to an increased risk of postpartum depression, lower birth rates, and increased number of doctor visits, right? And so not only is this impacting the mom, it's also impacting the child as well, or the baby as well, right? So it's not good for the mom, not good for the baby either as well.
Yeah, it's amazing the research and the studies that have been done for this. But just stepping back a minute or two on what you're saying, folks, this is why we're here. You need to educate yourselves. You need to educate your managers. So, and I believe, in fact, we did an HR Stories podcast maybe a year or so, and we'll have those notes in the show. I'll have a link to that in the show notes below. But sometimes managers will overcompensate for someone. Oh my gosh, they're pregnant. I can't have them lifting boxes. I can't have them doing things like that. And that in itself, if an employee doesn't ask for that accommodation, that in itself can be a discriminatory practice. So there are a number of things to take and keep in mind.
Yeah, I definitely think, and the other thing that I would add to that, I know we both do this, but training your managers on law compliance is critical, especially if you're a small business owner, especially if you're an HR professional. When I'm talking to HR professionals, I'm like, look, 60% of your job is influenced by supervisors and managers. And if they don't know, right, and how are they going to know if we don't teach them, then they could stumble into something or do something that was not there. As an early in my career as a manager, I did things that I would never do now because I just didn't know anybody. No one had ever told me. So just don't assume that your managers know just because you know. Mm-hmm. And so kind of diving that in there and doing that. So lots of stories out there, Chuck. I wanted to focus on one story. And it happened to Julie, and that's not her real name, but when she applied for a job at the Ford Motor Company, working in the stamping plant in Chicago Heights during the summer of 2019. So she applied for a job there. And so Ford had requirements for all their candidates who received a job offer to pass a physical, a drug test, and a background check. So Julie was hired. She passed all 3 tests. And so she was good, right? So when she went to the doctor to get the physical, when she went to the Ford's doctor, she told the doctor she was pregnant. And on August 13th, 2019, right? So I'm sending these dates because you're going to see why a little bit later. The doctor cleared her for work.
Sure. So I think it's important to let our listeners know that companies can legally require employees to pass drug tests and background checks and even physicals if they are done in a non-discriminatory manner.
Yeah, and then there's a really good point, right, Chuck? And we got to make sure that they're being done on a consistent basis, right? We can't be like, oh, I don't think that person can do the job, so we're going to give them a physical, or wow, that person, they look like they use drugs, so I'm going to have them do a drug test, and you're not asking anyone else. Those can be discriminatory things. So we should know. I know my HR professionals know this. Consistency is our king, right? So being consistent with that as well. And so kind of making sure that we should do that.
Yeah, so correct. What happened in this case?
What happened to Julie, right? So she passed all 3 tests, right? The doctor cleared her for work. And then the way it was, right, she had to wait for Ford to say, okay, this will be your start date. And so she waited and waited. And then she would call in. There was a number that she could call in going, hey, when was my start date going? Hey, what's going to happen? What's going to go on? And guess what happened?
They didn't answer her, maybe?
Yeah. No, they didn't call her, right? They never called her. And she was like, well, what's going on here?
Yeah, that's a bad hiring. No, that's okay. I mean, I got to tell you, that's just such a bad hiring practice. I see it all the time. I read stories about this too. Listeners, the onboarding process is critical to an employee's perception of the company. And if you are not in touch with your employees, and in this case, it sounds like they were trying to avoid something, but think about it this way. You tell Julie she has a job, but then make her wait to start.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrations, again, putting the whole that she was pregnant aside, I think one of the frustrations is you're here, right? Oh, I got a job. But now you're telling everyone, I got a job. I'm so excited. I'm starting to work here, blah, blah, blah. And then nothing happens, right? And so now you're like, well, if I don't have a job, I have to go look for another job. And so now I'm not making any money during this period, right? And so now I'm not being able to support my family, do the things I want to do. I think that kind of gets in there as anyway. All right. So here's what happened, Chuck, right?
Yes.
It turned worse. So on October, remember, she was told, the doctor said she was cleared to work August 13th. In October, Ford told Julie that they were no longer hiring.
Yeah, 2 months. So, but they had already hired her 2 months earlier.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. And so they had. And so the thing, when they did the court case, they found out, and this is where, again, inconsistency, all other new hires had orientation and began their jobs in October. So the people that had been hired around the same time that she was hired were hired, new orientation, things were going on. The only difference was that Julie was pregnant.
Yeah. So I don't think I need to ask what happened, but what happened?
Yeah, right. What happened? So Julie and the EOC sued Ford, arguing that the company had discriminated against Julie because of her pregnancy. Ford denied that they had discriminated against Julie, but did settle the lawsuit this past fall, paying Julie $115,000 in back wages and that kind of stuff.
Okay. Interesting that Ford settled.
Yeah, I kind of see it, right? Because my guess on this, and I don't know this, but it was probably cheaper for them to settle for $115,000 than to go to court. My guess is that somebody in their HR department, somebody did not have any proper paperwork to say why they didn't hire Julie, right? Because maybe she was had a position, she was hired in a position, and they just didn't need anybody. Their line was slowing down and they didn't need anybody. But none of that was documented. And so they are like, well, look, nothing was documented. So, well, let's just settle, because if this goes to court, we're going to have to pay a lot more. And so let's kind of do that.
Yeah. And the sad thing is she had to wait 19 to 20, 21, 22, 3 years for this to come through. Look, one of the important lessons we learn in handling cases, it's documentation, it's consistency, and employees, applicants, they find out about these things. It's free for them to contact the EEOC. If the EEOC sees smoke, they may see fire, and they're going to go for it. And in this case, if it wasn't documented, then as far as why they did not hire Julie, they're going to assume, and there's no way to prove it, that there was something else. They're going to assume it was because of a discriminatory practice. And that's pretty much where we're going to leave it. John, did you want to take a break now and maybe come back with talk about?
Yeah. We have a story, right? We have our story, our interview that we did with our producer, our social media producer. We'll take a break and we'll come back. We'll come back and we'll talk about Kait's story when we come back.
Hello, listeners. I have some questions for you. Do you find yourself struggling with HR and employment issues? Are you afraid you could make the wrong employment decision that will cost your company thousands or even millions of dollars? Maybe you're new to the world of HR, or you've been in HR for a while and you just wish you had one resource, a guide to help you get HR right. Well, I've got good news for you. The team at HR Stories is excited to announce a new comprehensive resource, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. We created the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists as a simple, step-by-step resource guide packed with 70 downloadable checklists and other resources that help small businesses and organizations get human resources right. Even with very little HR or management experience, you can get instant results with concise, practical steps for addressing many of your tough employment issues. Do not miss out. Go to hrchecklist.com to learn more. That's hrchecklists with an S.com to learn more. And as always, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where the lesson is always in the story.
Welcome back from break, everyone. Thank you guys for doing that. As I said earlier, this morning we had a chance to interview Kait, who is our social media producer. So she does our social media for the HR Stories podcast. She does our social media for the team at HR Stories. She does our social for the team of Community of One on Facebook. And so we were telling her what the podcast was about. She was telling us this story of when she was having her first child, when she was pregnant with her first child, and what happened during the pregnancy and the conflict she had with their salary payment schedules. And then also after she had the child and when she went back to work, what the company was doing. So I want to kind of talk about things, but then I want to let her speak in her own words. We'll play a clip. But originally, she was a salesperson, right? So she was a salesperson, and the company's like, we're going to pay you 100% of your salary. And she's like, well, what about commission? And they're like, oh, we don't pay commission. And so you think somebody that does sales, and she was saying that I think her commission was twice her normal salary, so 2 or 3 times her normal salary. And so they were saying, well, basically, I don't know how much she was making, but basically, if she was making fully in her commission $150,000 a year, they were saying, well, you're only going to be making $50,000 while you're out on leave. And that may seem generous, but here's the thing. She was going to be out when most of the people were placing the ads for the next year. And what they were saying is, look, if somebody places the ad and you're out, you're not going to get commission for a whole year. So not only was it going to impact the time she was out, but it was going to impact that full time as well. And so kind of paying attention to that, right? And so Chuck was doing some research into this. Chuck, I don't know if you want to talk about that FMLA and what they say. And I know we didn't get the full information, but kind of give me your thoughts on it for now.
All I want to just tell our readers, there are some guidance that the Family Medical Leave Act, and she was approved for FMLA, covers regarding commissions and sales commissions when someone is out. There's a lot there, more than just a quick soundbite here, but I would urge our listeners to do their research. There are court cases that cover the paying of sales commissions and bonuses when someone is out. The bottom line is, in most cases, you do have to pay those, even though FMLA is considered unpaid.
Yeah, and so again, just knowing that and kind of paying attention. The other thing that happened to Kait that she shared with us was when she came back to the workplace, they were very, I don't know what the right word is, Chuck, but they were really getting into her business. You know what? Let's do this. Let's play the clip, and then you'll hear her in her own words talk about the situation with her human resources manager, asking her, when are you going to be breastfeeding your child, and how many, when are your work? You can't do that during the workplace, blah, 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 right? So kind of let's listen to that clip, and then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about it.
I had an infant. I made the mistake of telling my coworker, the other person in sales, that it's like, yeah, it's hard, because I'm breastfeeding. So sometimes there's times where the baby's crying and I need to go get her or whatever. And she was like, oh, you didn't send her to daycare. And I was like, well, no, like COVID is still very much a thing. So like, I'm doing what I can to keep her home. And I knew other people that I worked with, their kids were at home too. She was like, well, I just want you to know that I'm working full 8 hours a day. And I expect that you are too. I was like, sometimes I wake up and I start working earlier and I work later at night. I reached out to my new boss and was like, I had a really weird conversation. And like, if people think I'm not working, like, I want to address this. He was like, all right, let's get on a call. So I got on the call and he was like, hey, just wanted to let you know that this person from HR, the same person, is also on the call. And she was like, oh, so you don't have full-time childcare? And I was like, well, it's pretty much covered. I didn't send her to daycare. And she was like, oh, well, why didn't you? I was like, well, because COVID, it's really dangerous for kids to get that. And she just kept questioning me about things. And then she was like, so what hours are you working? And I was like, the normal amount of hours, but sometimes I start working earlier and sometimes I keep working later. Then both of them were like, well, we had no idea that you weren't working an uninterrupted 8 hours a day. And they were like, well, we expect everyone to be starting work at 8. I asked everyone and they were like, no, work starts at 9. She said that you have 30 minutes for lunch and any time other than like a 15-minute break here and there, like, isn't accounted for. That doesn't count into your 8 hours. So they asked me to put together a breakdown of what hours I'm working exactly, taking out my pumping / breastfeeding breaks and lunch, because none of those are counted towards 8 hours. So I reached out to another girl that had a kid and was like, I just need to know how other people are being treated. And she was like, oh no, I didn't send my kids to daycare. Like, obviously I can't right now. And I was like, and have you been asked to put together a schedule of your pumping breaks? And she was like, no, oh my God. So I pushed back again and was like, I can put together some sort of daily schedule, but I'm in sales. Like, I'm working all the time. So like, if you're telling me that this is when I start and this is when I end, like, I won't be working before and after that from now on. They didn't like that. And I was like, I don't know what to do here.
Yeah.
So it was at that point that I finally said, okay, here's my schedule. And then I quit.
Yeah.
Like a few weeks after that.
Yeah. So what I see there is hostility. And I think that's the word you were looking for. There was like a little bit of aggressive hostility. There was a little bit of a stance to run interference, to put someone through some hoops that were not necessarily needed, perhaps. But it's interesting enough, that was from several years ago. There are 2 new laws that are going to be impacting her situation should it occur today, especially on how employers deal with pregnancy in the workplace that we are going to, talk about right now.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree, right? And so the first law is titled the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act, which extends to more nursing employees the right to receive break time to pump and also to have a private place to pump at work. The FLSA, the Fair Labor Standard Act, requires employers to provide a reasonable break time for an employee to express milk for their nursing child for 1 year after the child's birth, and covered employees may take a reasonable break each time such employee has a need to express the milk. An employee may not deny a covered employee a needed break to pump.
Sure. And the other part is location. Location must be provided to express that milk. If it is not a dedicated space, it needs to be available when it's needed by the employee. In other words, if for example, we have a general area here, we can't just take out one office 7 days a week for the next several months for that employee to express milk, but we can create one when needed. And as I remember, the space needs to be shielded from view and free from intrusions from other coworkers and the public. And it cannot be a bathroom. And I know a lot of times that's sometimes the go-to, they can just go into the bathroom. It can't be the bathroom.
There's a stall in there. And somebody said to me once, it's like, would you eat your lunch in the bathroom? Which is to me like, oh yeah, good reminder, right? I'm not going to do that. So Chuck, would a supply closet work?
Yeah, well, once again, it depends. Does it have a lock on the door? Is it shielded from public view? Is there a place for the employee to sit? Is there electricity? Maybe nice to have maybe a refrigerator store milk, but sure. The other thing is, John, the employer has to make these accommodations available for up to a year, okay, after the employee returns back. So that is one thing that is part of this law also.
Yeah, which is good, right? Kind of putting that in there. So if you're wondering if your organization meets this requirements, Chuck, you have created a checklist. Is that correct? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know you sent me some kind of document in the middle of the night. I think that was the checklist.
Yeah, folks, as you may or may not know, John and I wrote a book. It's the ultimate book of HR checklists. It's Getting HR Right. We've got over 70 checklists, basically boiling down many of the employment processes into easy to understand step-by-step checklists. So we've created 2 checklists in relation to the 2 laws that we're talking about today, and we're offering them for free to our listeners. And the way to get that would be to go into our show notes here. You'll be able to see the link. Just click on there, send us your email, and we will get you those 2 checklists on these 2 laws that we're talking about. In addition, John, there are fact sheets the Department of Labor puts out there. I believe fact sheet number 73, just so everyone's clear, a fact sheet is something the Department of Labor issues on things like this to give us more information about a particular subject, and it's definitely a must read. And we've taken a lot of these fact sheets in the laws, and we have boiled them down into a easily understood step-by-step checklist.
Which, I mean, that checklist then could be shared with your store managers, your plant managers, your office managers, so they could use it if they have that kind of situation, kind of a place to go, oh gosh, we have this situation, let's do it. Pregnancy is one of those things that we may not have to deal with it every day, but it's important when we do have to deal with it. we know what to do in the right place, right? And so kind of doing that and making sure that we get on there as well.
Yeah, and we may have some listeners saying, "Oh yeah, I know about that pump back thing. When it placed into effect a couple years ago." Well, the December 22 version strengthens that, and it now allows employees to sue their employers for monetary damages and monetary awards. So be on notice.
Yeah, right. And so kind of getting into that as well.
Yeah. What is the second law, John, you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, always keeping us on topic, keeping us moving along. All right. So in June, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act will go into effect. And it applies to any employer with 15 employees or more and addresses the gap in the current workplace and allows pregnant employees to continue working with a reasonable accommodation.
Yeah, like the ADA, and I'm talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Okay, yeah. And in fact, it really does mirror the Americans with Disability Act. Under the Americans with Disability Act, pregnancy is not a disability, right? Pregnancy is not a disability. Now, that doesn't mean during that pregnancy a disability can occur, but itself isn't. So what the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act does is really apply that same concept of reasonable accommodations and undue hardship to a pregnant worker. So pregnant workers are not entitled to the accommodation of their choice. Again, the employer will get to choose. However, the employer cannot require the employee to take a leave of absence, paid or unpaid, if another reasonable accommodation exists that would create undue hardships on the employee. Yeah.
So at this point, and when this goes into effect in June of 2023, as John says, employers need to treat pregnant workers as they would someone under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, right, and we talk about this in our classes, is a lot of the times these laws are put out, right, by our government, and then we get interpretations because the courts are interpreting them because somebody's suing that, like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, that kind of. And so we'll get more clarification probably over the next year to really better understand that. But again, paying attention to this, I know the Department of Labor is doing some webinars around this. I know a lot of lawyers are also doing it. So there's more information out there, but we wanted to make sure that you're paying attention to it. You have it on your radar because it will impact how you deal with pregnant workers in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of good story, a lot of good information for our listeners. I would say on my final thoughts, John, folks, listeners, we will in our show notes, we'll have some links to some fact sheets. We'll have a link on how to get our exclusive checklists. These are free to you, these 2 free checklists, but they're great samples for you to look at to see what you could get in the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. You would just need to go to hrchecklists.com. That's hrchecklist.com to get more, to see screenshots of our new book and such. But there are a lot of legal pitfalls and landmines that our employers, our listeners need to keep in mind. And that's what we're trying to do here at the HR Stories podcast and as the team at HR Stories.
Yeah. And the one thing that I would say is as you're going through your work, there's compliance law, right? And of course, we want to be compliant, but you also want to create a culture, which is so important to retention and having great employees and profits and all that kind of stuff. Creating that right culture where you're treating everyone with grace, you're treating everyone fairly across the board, really will help you be in a better place than that. And so kind of paying attention to that, I think really important to do that as well. Just as a reminder, we will have Kait's full story after the end, after our little outro, you'll hear Kait's story. So you can kind of listen to that, get the full story there, and see how that helps you.
All right. John, any other final thoughts?
No, that's it. Those are my final thoughts for today. Thank you guys for listening today.
Thanks for listening to the HR Podcast, where there's a lesson in every story.
Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or an HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we're providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the team at hrstories.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business and nonprofit. Thank you for listening to HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. Please stand by for the interview that we had with Kait. We got our first guest on the air.
Hello, Kait. Welcome to the HR Stories podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah.
Hey,
Kait,
thanks for being here.
Yeah, and Kait, as you know, because you are our social media producer at Front Porch Social, our basic thing here at HR Stories podcast is there's always a lesson in the story. And I believe you have a story for us in regards to our subject matter today.
Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to you and what was the ramifications, Kait?
Yeah. So at my last job, I was working in advertising sales for a financial newsletter. So I sold the ad space in newsletters that came out weekly. Right before COVID, that company got purchased by a bigger company. So a larger company was coming in who actually had like HR and everything, which seemed like a good thing, but didn't work out that way for me. I also found out I was pregnant around the same time that happened. COVID happened. I ended up coming to Florida. So I was in New Jersey. I didn't plan to move to Florida. We were like, oh, we'll get away for a few weeks while this blows over. And then we just ended up staying because everyone's office was closed for like 2 years. So I initially told them that I was pregnant in March and my due date was in September, and that seemed fine. Then they told me that their policy for sales positions were that they paid 100% of your salary, but you didn't get any commissions while you were away. And I was like, well, that sucks. I started asking more questions and I was like, does that mean that I don't get the commissions for ads that run while I'm not there, or for my repeat customers that book an ad while I'm not there? And they were like, we have no idea.
Oh, wow.
Apparently I was the first sales position who had gone on maternity leave.
Got it. So typically you would get your salary plus the commission based on the ads that were placed in the financial newsletter, right? Just, I want to clarify.
Right.
For our listeners.
Yeah. And just for an idea, my commission was like double my salary.
Okay. Wow.
I got on like 4 or 5 calls over the next few months trying to explain to both HR and my new boss how the ads work. I was going to be on maternity leave essentially October, November, December, some of January. That is when the majority of my clients are getting their new budgets and re-signing for the new year. So I explained that and I was like, you know, if all of these clients that I've been working for years, that's when they get their budget and that's when they resign, then I essentially, if I'm not getting commission on any of those things, why would I keep working?
Right, because that would impact you for the whole next year.
Yeah.
Right, because you wouldn't be getting that commission. Somebody else would get those commissions throughout the year because they actually book the thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
So my boss he seemed like he was really trying, which was nice. but I just kept having that same conversation with them.
Yeah. And I mean, they're basically discounting all that relationship building you did up to that point and going, well, it doesn't matter. When they pull the trigger is when they get that commission. Right. And so,
right. And this went on for a while. So then my boss finally came up with this idea that if there was already a contract and they signed, that I would get, and it was a repeat customer, I would get 100% of those commissions.
Okay.
And then as soon as I got back, I would get all the commissions as usual. But anything that ran in that time, if I hadn't made a contract for it, but it was my repeat customer, I would only get like 50% of the commissions or something like that. And I was like, well, this kind of sucks, but like, you know, I feel like that's probably the best we can do at this point, because I'd worked so hard for them to understand it enough to get there. So I was like, okay.
It's interesting because they're not saying it, and it may not have been their intention, but it really, in your case or in anybody's case, it sort of makes that decision. Well, I can't go on leave because I'm going to lose a lot of money, right? And then, so they're kind of pushing you out, right? Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and so it was just me and another lady that did sales in this specific situation. And I asked her, she had her kids like 20 years ago. And it was that classic, you know, well, like I went through hell, so should you. It was like, I couldn't even take a leave. I was the only one there. And I was like, okay, well, if you're the only one there though, like that almost works out better, because you can set everything up and then, you know, and I even offered also, I was like, what if I just take 1 month off? And then for a few months, I come back like 2 or 3 days a week, since it's the busy time.
Right.
And they were like, no, you have to take everything or nothing.
Wow.
And I was like, great. So unhelpful.
Kate, were you considered taking FMLA?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was official FMLA leave, correct?
Some of it was.
Do you recall?
We had like 4 months of maternity leave total. So some of it was that, and some of it was just them.
Okay.
And the HR girl was very unfriendly and unhelpful, and reminded me multiple times that under the past company, I wouldn't have gotten any commissions. So during this time, I also was getting pulled into a lot of other meetings about sort of the transition. And there was a lot of conversation of maybe me moving to another, like more on a marketing role, more on like an operations.
Well, I was going to ask you, so after this was settled, I know you had a situation after you came back with the baby and some other pregnancy situations.
So first of all, I kept asking for them to like give me the like exactly what I need to do to show what is at what process. And it was literally like 2 days before my due date, I think, that they finally sent me something where I had to fill in all this information. I was in labor, like trying to fill out this information, cranking out any repeat customer that I thought might sign. I was just making a proposal and sending it to them.
Wow.
So then I have the baby, I go on leave, everything seems fine. I come back. So I look at the commissions and I realize that I didn't get paid for like a ton of stuff. The third day I was back, I had my, performance
annual review. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was great. So then I brought up the commissions and I was like, hey, I noticed that I hadn't been paid on a lot of things that I should have been. And he was like, why don't you talk to the person in accounting or whatever? So I talked to them and they're like, this guy is the person that tells us what to do. This is what I was told to pay you for.
Right.
I went back through all the things that I should have been paid on. I said, here's why. And I sent it to them and they were like, well, we can't do anything without your boss approving it. So I sent it to him and he was like, because you didn't write a number on the spreadsheet you sent me, it didn't matter. Since you didn't follow the rules, you know, we can't pay you on those things.
Rules that you didn't know about.
So I had the receipts and went back through and was like, actually, I followed exactly what you said. Here's why. Here's all the emails. Here's everything.
Wow.
He came back a few days later and said, the accounting department has decided that we can give you this money, but it'll be a retention bonus. So if you leave in less than a year, you have to pay it back.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. Yeah. I got it now. Wow.
And I was like, wow, that's so convenient for you to tell a new mom who you're, thinking might leave. This is money that I worked for and I brought into the company. So it's not a retention bonus. That would be if you were giving me something extra.
Right. Yeah.
So that's how we left the conversation. And I wasn't rude, but I was just like, no, and here's why.
Right.
So then I sent a follow-up email and he replied back and said, as per our conversation, we'll pay you this as a retention bonus, or like, that's it, and copied the HR person. That's actually not how the conversation went.
Right.
And I explained why that wasn't acceptable. And so then the HR lady was like, oh, can we get on a phone call? And I was like, no, I'd rather keep this over email because my last conversation, there was a disconnect.
Right.
So I don't want to have that again. And she said, your unwillingness to get on the phone has been duly noted. And I was like, okay, good. During this time, I stopped, like, none of the conversation from before where, like, maybe I was going to do something else in the right. business. Like, all of that just died. And I had to go back and forth with this HR person who was incredibly unfriendly and unhelpful. So I had to send her emails for every account that shows that I had talked to them about advertising.
Was there any conversation? Did they come to you and say, are you going to leave? Are you thinking of leaving now that you have a kid? Or any of that kind of conversations come up?
During this time, we bought a house in Florida. Everyone was still remote.
Yeah.
And the HR person, when they reached out to confirm employment, and she messaged me and said, someone just reached out to confirm employment. I assume you're buying a house. Is that correct? And I was like, oh, I'm confused. Like, I thought they were just asking to confirm employment. Were they asking something else? And she was like, no, they asked to confirm employment. I'm asking if you're buying a house. I was like, yeah, we're buying a house. And she was like, in Florida or New Jersey? And I said, in Florida, but it might be an investment property. And she was like really upset about that. So then she asked me a few times if I was planning to return to New Jersey. And I said, when the office opens, the plan is for me to return. Because at this point, I had started to realize that I probably wasn't doing that. Right. So she did ask me a few things like that, not necessarily if I was going to leave. But then she did say at one point when they were talking about the retention bonus, well, if you're not planning to leave, it really doesn't matter. I was not planning to leave.
Right.
But now I'm starting to think about it. I didn't say any of that, but.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, again, if you're not getting the commissions, is somebody else getting the commissions? And are they afraid that they have to take that money away? And so the only way they can make this happen is, we'll give her a retention bonus, right? Now it just gets complicated.
And that's part of what I assumed happened because, I mean, I understand who made a mistake, and it wasn't me, and it wasn't the accounting person. This person didn't want to have to go back and be like, hey, I didn't do this correctly.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to pay this. After all this, they finally sent me the check, and my boss put someone else in charge of us. During this time, it was still like very much COVID. No one was in the office. I had an infant. I made the mistake of telling my coworker, the other person in sales, that it's like, yeah, it's hard, because I'm breastfeeding. So sometimes there's times where the baby's crying and I need to go get her or whatever. And she was like, oh, you didn't send her to daycare. And I was like, well, no, like COVID is still very much a thing. So like, I'm doing what I can to keep her home. And I knew other people that I worked with, their kids were at home too. She was like, well, I just want you to know that I'm working full 8 hours a day. And I expect that you are too. I was like, sometimes I wake up and I start working earlier. And I work later at night. I reached out to my new boss and was like, I had a really weird conversation. And like, if people think I'm not working, like, I want to address this. He was like, all right, let's get on a call. So I got on the call and he was like, hey, just wanted to let you know that this person from HR, the same person, is also on the call. And she was like, oh, so you don't have full-time childcare? And I was like, well, it's pretty much covered. I didn't send her to daycare. And she was like, oh, well, why didn't you? I was like, well, because COVID, it's really dangerous for kids to get that. And she just kept questioning me about things. And then she was like, so what hours are you working? And I was like, the normal amount of hours, but sometimes I start working earlier and sometimes I keep working later. Then both of them were like, well, we had no idea that you weren't working an uninterrupted 8 hours a day. And they were like, well, we expect everyone to be starting work at 8. I asked everyone and they were like, no, work starts at 9. She said that you have 30 minutes for lunch and anytime other than like a 15-minute break here and there, like isn't accounted for. That doesn't count into your 8 hours. So they asked me to put together a breakdown of what hours I'm working exactly, taking out my pumping / breastfeeding breaks and lunch, because none of those are counted towards 8 hours. So I reached out to another girl that had a kid and was like, I just need to know how other people are being treated. And she was like, oh no, I didn't send my kids to daycare. Like, obviously I can't right now. And I was like, and have you been asked to put together a schedule of your pumping breaks? And she was like, no, oh my God. So I pushed back again and was like, I can put together some sort of daily schedule, but I'm in sales. Like, I'm working all the time. So like, if you're telling me that this is when I start and this is when I end, like I won't be working before and after that from now on. They didn't like that. And I was like, I don't know what to do here.
Yeah.
So it was at that point that I finally said, okay, here's my schedule. And then I quit.
Yeah.
Like a few weeks after that.
It's so interesting because it ties into the conversation we're having, Chuck, right? About the pump laws and, giving moms that have to express milk. It's required to give them breaks. And so not sure where that HR person was coming from. It's very interesting. It's understanding what can be done and what can't be done. And it looks like they were signaling you out, and I would guess because you pushed back on the whole compensation thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it felt to me. Like nobody else was being asked these questions or being treated that way. And it just, especially because like I had a review that said I was doing great. I even had a half-year review in that time that said like, yeah, your sales are great, whatever. So like there is nothing showing that I was slacking on work. So it made no sense why they would, push back in that way, unless someone was upset that I had caused a problem somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I've been writing some notes here. I see retaliation came up, and FMLA and sales commissions. And there are some, the FMLA doesn't specifically cover it, but there are some case laws out there where companies do have to pay certain commissions when someone's out on FMLA. So obviously that was not taken into consideration here either.
Yeah.
Hey, the good news is that you started your own company. And you're, having a wonderful life and things are going well. And you got to leave that toxic workplace behind.
Yeah. And that's like, I am in this privileged position where like I had someone else who could help support me while I built up my business and I had the availability to leave. But like not everybody can.
Right. Yeah. I mean, think about somebody that was a single mom in that same situation. They would just be like, all right, I got to do what I got to do to have that job.
And I did talk to a lawyer at one point where I was like, this doesn't seem right. And she basically told me there was a lot of gray space. So like I could try to sue them and it could work out, but you could also just get someone who's like, no. And then like you've wasted your time and money and energy.
What advice would you give to somebody going through this or something similar?
I would probably try to have all my research done on my end, the most that I could, of like what they had to do for you. Maybe talk to a lawyer beforehand if you have someone you can without having to pay for it.
Yeah. Talk to somebody that has some kind of expertise. So you could, it sounds like you did a lot of research, and knowing you, I'm sure you did a lot of research. But doing that research ahead, like, okay, so what does FMLA say about commissions? What does, what's the policy? What can I do? What can I do? And really defining that ahead of time is going to be key. And so I think, this is for our listeners, really, if you're a mom to be, and you're going to have that conversation with your boss and your HR, partner with them early on. Now, listen, Kait was in a situation where there was a evil HR person, I'll say it. And that's not always the case, right? And I would say that's probably not most of the time. And have those conversations. Okay, what do I need? What paperwork do I need to do? What do I need to do to make sure that I'm continuously getting paid? Or how long can I have on leave? And asking those questions so you're prepared when the time comes. Chuck, what advice would you give?
Yeah, the advice would be along the same lines. Obtain wise counsel. Do what you can, to research on your own. You did contact an attorney, but I do want to let our listeners know, and everyone, that you don't actually have to, in situations like this, the Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division, as well as the EEOC offers opportunities to lodge complaints, and you're protected by the law against any retaliation for exercising your right. And the cost to lodge a formal complaint or concern where you think you might have been discriminated against or retaliated against is free. It's your taxes at work. Yeah, so I always want to make sure I mention to people that is an option that they should explore. Always.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Well, Kait, thanks for being here today. I love that you got to tell your story. Sorry you had to happen to it, but hopefully we can use it as lessons for other people that get into that same situation. But thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, of course.